welcome. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I'm with the Nature Conservancy and the Ag Team in Ohio. We're so excited to have you here for our Lunch and Learn today. We have Robyn Wilson, along with Esmeri Jahil and Anna Bosworth, all from Ohio State. They are going to be talking about the Farmer Advocates for Conservation and the evaluation that they did of this project. Just a little background on the project. This was funded by a US EPA grant from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The Nature Conservancy received these funds back in 2020, and the funds were to train farmers who were doing conservation practices and teach them to elevate their voices. And the grant funds allowed us to compensate them to both be trained and to mentor other farmers. So from the very beginning, Dr. Robyn Wilson was part of the proposal and was on board to do this evaluation. And now that we have come to an end to this particular project, she and her team are going to give us the work that they've done to evaluate it. Just as a note, this funding was specific to the Maumee River watershed, so we focused there, but we do have intentions to continue farmer mentoring throughout the state of Ohio and to help support that and facilitate that, because we do think it's really important. Just a little bit of logistics. If you have a question, Robyn said that you're welcome to come off of mute or raise your hand or put it in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, and then we'll try to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robyn. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks. Hear me okay still, Stephanie? I'll assume unless
Yep,
someone
we can hear you great.
Great. I am in New Zealand and it is 6 a.m., but I think I have good internet and we should be good. But someone let me know if anything goes awry. So thank you. I do want to recognize again Ajmiri, Anna, and Jillian, all former students of various kinds in my lab who have been involved in this project over time. And Ajmiri and Anna were able to join today to listen in and to jump in if they can help with answering any of the questions. Make sure this goes. There we go. So some of you already probably knew quite a bit about this program. Stephanie gave a little bit of an overview for maybe those who are not as familiar. But really, a lot of the motivation for this, and you see this in the bigger literature around conservation and agriculture, is this kind of critique of traditional outreach. That it might be ineffective for reaching kind of middle and late adopters, that the way we traditionally, through extension and other sorts of formal mechanisms, reach farmers has been great for those innovator, kind of early adopter farmers, but that it may not be as effective for kind of the key groups we want to reach now. And so what's nice about this project is that it was a look at peer learning, and Stephanie wanted to bring in, more of an evaluation of this project than you see in a lot of projects. So in fact, I was part of a team several years ago now who was brought in by the EPA to actually look at the cost effectiveness of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding. And one of the big critiques that we provided back to the EPA is that a lot of what they are funding is just reporting outputs and not outcomes. And so they're reporting activities that were done. We put out this newsletter, we talked to these people, I know the people we talked to manage this many acres, and that's fine, but that doesn't really tell you about the impact of what was being done. And so we wanted to try to bring in, as best as we could, more of a measure of those outcomes. So not just what our advocates were doing to try to reach their neighbors and friends and peers, but also what was happening as a result of that. And outcome evaluation is hard. So we went through a lot of iterations early on in the project with our advocates, with our advisory team, kind of proposing different maybe ideal ways of evaluating the program, and not all of the ideal ways from a kind of research and evaluation standpoint were as feasible or as comfortable for some of the advocates and partners. And so we settled on kind of I suppose I'll call it a triangulation approach. We had evaluation surveys, so kind of traditional surveys that advocates could hand out or provide to people at the close of an event or at the close of some sort of prolonged engagement with an individual to give us one kind of piece of information about the impact that that evaluation or that engagement was having. We also did focus groups, both with our advocates and with some of the engaged farmers throughout the life of the project to try to get more of that kind of qualitative, open-ended feedback from engaged farmers as to the impact the program was having on them. And then we also did a project end watershed survey just last year, trying to look at differences between people who were engaged by the advocates and people who were not to see what differences there were and what they were kind of thinking and feeling and doing. And so all of this we've put together as a kind of snapshot of feedback from the farmers who were engaged through the program by the advocates to better understand the impact that the program was having. And so I'll just walk through kind of a snapshot of some of the findings. I'll try to keep it pretty quick so we have some time for discussion or questions at the end. I also have a QR code on the last slide that takes you to our website where you can look at the full report we put together. And so it has all of the things that we learned from those 3 different efforts. So a little bit about the farmers who were engaged. They were younger, more educated, and managed larger farms compared to a general Midwest farming population. And so there was some interest in this project and very purposefully engaging middle adopters, and thinking that perhaps this sort of peer engagement would be even more effective for that kind of group of individuals who are kind of thinking about these things but aren't really sure how to implement, could use a little help kind of working through the logistics and some of the challenges. And we see some evidence that is probably the group that our advocates were engaging. So average farm size, about 1,000 acres. So still not a huge farm by some definitions, but bigger than the average farm when you look across the Maumee River Basin, for instance, or the Great Lakes or the Eastern Corn Belt. Average age of engaged farmers was about 43 years old. So again, younger than kind of the average farmer. Bachelor's degree was the kind of typical formal education and about 18 years farming. So that's who we're talking about with some of this data. Like this is the group that was providing feedback on how things went. We did see this was from some of the focus group research, that this is really a preferred learning environment. So the engaged farmers did really prefer this more informal, personalized learning over those traditional formal settings. We also saw some evidence that one-on-one interactions were favored over large group meetings, but even over maybe small group meetings for flexibility and confidentiality. So one of the goals of this project was to get, kind of a small group of farmers to work with an advocate, to have discussions over time, to problem solve, ask questions, create opportunities to kind of deliberate over the challenges of doing conservation. And there were some people who did that, and there was some interest in that, but there was a lot of feedback that it can be uncomfortable to talk about the challenges you're having in that sort of group setting, and it might be more comfortable just having that peer advocate that you sit down with one-on-one, and that creates maybe kind of a safer space to talk about what you're doing, what you want to do, the challenges you're having, and how to solve them. We did also see, and this was from our evaluation survey, so you can kind of see the numbers down here so you get a sense of which data set this is coming from, that the engaged farmers were really satisfied with their advocates. So this is a pat on the back for our advocates who were working really hard over the last several years. Engaged farmers valued advocates as accessible and supportive sources of information. Farmers desire continued engagement with their advocates. So like Stephanie said, there's interest in continuing to push these opportunities, not only for those who have already been involved, but for new farmers moving forward. But there were some opportunities to do things better. So you can see in this one kind of bar to the far right, a little lower score on the extent to which the advocate could help the farmer tailor conservation practices to their farm. And so this is one of the things we've talked about quite a bit that we even saw in the more qualitative feedback, is that we may need to do a better job finding a diverse range of advocates who operate different kinds of farms, and so that the diverse world of farmers out there can find someone who's really similar to them and can maybe help them address the kind of unique challenges that they face on their operation. And so that's one of the things we can kind of think about trying to do better moving forward. Here is a look at feedback from our focus groups. The red bars was feedback we heard from the advocates who were doing this work. The dark grayish black bars were the engaged farmers that we were able to talk to. And so you can see some differences in the sorts of program benefits they talked about, but some similarities too. And so some of the key benefits were uh, the trusted peer advice, being able to observe successful practices, seeing those practical demonstrations, having that one-on-one support, and this idea that hearing both successes and failures helped normalize challenges and build confidence. So there might be a bias in some of our traditional outreach towards just talking about success. And we've heard this anecdotally from farmers who might go to a field day and say, well, that's great that this works so well for this person, but I'm not sure how it's going to work for me. And so this sort of peer informal learning created those opportunities to be really honest, both about the good and the bad, and build some confidence around people who are not real sure how to bring these practices into their operation. And so again, the black farm bars are the engaged farmers. And so you can see they did talk the most about peers being more trusted than a lot of the other sources of conservation information. And they did talk about the value of observing in this informal learning setting and then these one-on-one connections. And then we wanted to measure not just that kind of feedback on how are things going. Did you have a good time? Was it helpful? But did we see actual impacts on things that matter? So on, did we see an increase in adoption of conservation behaviors? Did we see an increase in farmers at least wanting to do these things, even if they haven't been able to do it quite yet, but they're on that kind of journey towards making some changes? Did we see changes in things that they believe to be true that might help them eventually adopt these practices? And so one of those things we looked at was their confidence and their ability to implement practices. So we see in a lot of work that my team has done over the years that a lot of farmers, the majority of farmers in these regions we're working in, really believe good farmers do conservation and they want to do it, but they struggle a bit with the feasibility and the effectiveness of the practices. And so that's really kind of confidence is one piece of that. And you can see that when we asked to what extent did engaging with the advocates increase your confidence, again, pretty high scores, moderately to very on the scales that we were using. And in fact, in another metric where we collected similar data, approximately a third of the engaged farmers reported a change in knowledge or beliefs, that should say, due to the advocate. And advocates specifically boosted confidence for things like continuous no-till and winter cover crops more than other conservation practices, soil health practices, and water management practices. But we think probably the focused engagement likely drove those effects because that was a real focus for a lot of our advocates, was on soil health and was on this combination of continuous no-till and winter cover crops. In terms of their intentions to do more, again, we see pretty positive results here. How impactful is engaging with the advocate in your future plans to use any of these practices? And again, for cover crops and continuous no-till, scores between kind of 2 and 3, so moderately to very impactful. So again, we see a boost in those intentions for these two practices. And again, we think that focused engagement probably had something to do with that. And then when you look at actual adoption, and this was a thing we would have loved to see a lot of, but also as a behavioral scientist, I recognize that no human can suddenly change their perspective on something and snap their fingers and do it the next day. So we were hoping to see some increase in adoption of practices, but again, also that those indicators that the trend is moving towards adoption for those who are kind of working through the challenges. And here, this was a question from the focus groups, I think. Did engaging with a farmer advocate result in any changes to your practices as a result? And again, about a third said yes, I changed at least one practice as a result. About half said no, and I don't plan to make changes in the future. But again, about 20 said 20% no, but I do plan to make changes in the future as a result. So a good half of the farmers that were engaged by the advocates were either changing things already or working towards that. Yeah, so continued engagement is key to long-term success. So when about 20% are saying, I want to change in the future, we don't want to abandon them as they're thinking through those questions and those challenges and working towards that. Um, Yeah, so we also tried to look at in our Project N survey what things were different between our engaged and unengaged farmers. And the Project N survey was a little tricky because the population we were able to represent in that survey leaned a lot older, operating much smaller farms. So we were really capturing kind of a different group, maybe a more representative group in some ways of the full population of farmers in the Maumee River Basin, but definitely a different group than the set of 50 or so people that we got feedback from that we know were engaged over the life of the project. And so we saw a lot of similarities between the engaged and the unengaged in that project and survey. Um, but one of the differences that we saw is that engaged farmers were really motivated by conservation goals, while the unengaged farmers were motivated by other things like seeing results, for instance. So we do see some differences um, in kind of what might motivate people who want to work with an advocate and people who don't. Or perhaps, again, evidence that the advocates were able to increase that focus on conservation goals for some of those engaged farmers. Both groups, and this again was from our Project N survey, so again, capturing kind of an older, smaller farm audience relative to the group we were able to capture with the evaluation survey. But we saw that farmers who reported being engaged by at least one of the advocates versus not, generally disagreed that conservation practices are ineffective or financially burdensome. And so that's kind of good news, right? So even those who, aren't really working with an advocate don't necessarily see those things as the biggest barriers. What we did see is unengaged farmers see additional barriers. And so they're more likely to talk about their distrust of government contracts. And so again, it's just going to be hard to engage some segments of the farming population who just are not interested in those programs. And that's one of the mechanisms that obviously our advocates can promote as a way to make it um, a little bit easier to try out these practices. We also see that, again, this is comparing the farmers who said they were engaged and the farmers who weren't in our Project N survey. And you see a few differences here. So one, we see that weather uncertainty this is for cover crops in particular. Weather uncertainty is the most significant challenge, and this is just one of the really hard things that we can't do a lot about in some ways, but where having that ability to problem solve and work through ways to navigate that with peers could be really useful. And we do see that the unengaged farmers are still experiencing or perceiving much bigger barriers around the costs and the time that it takes to do something like cover crops. And so again, it's hard to know with just kind of comparing these two groups if the engaged farmers who perceive those barriers as lower, if they are just different than the unengaged farmers completely, or if perhaps again working with advocates started to maybe decrease their concerns about some of these challenges that they face when doing cover crops. And similarly here, we were looking at how effective they think winter cover crops are for achieving various goals on their farm. And we see that engaged farmers rated those conservation practices as more effective than unengaged farmers. So again, from the way we collected the data, engagement may drive or reinforce belief and practice effectiveness. So it might be that farmers who choose to engage with an advocate already believe more in these practices, and so that engagement can kind of reinforce that belief. Or it could be that engagement was driving those beliefs up. One of the things that we'd like to do differently moving forward is the program was unfamiliar to most farmers surveyed in the counties where advocates were doing their engagement. So again, we just randomly surveyed farmers from across all the counties where our advocates were doing work. And we saw, interestingly, and what's kind of interesting about this is about 16% of the farmers we surveyed said they had heard of the program. About 15% were not sure. 68% had not heard of it. What's interesting is the very first page of the survey listed all the farmer advocate names. And so they could check, like, is this someone that you've talked with conservation about? So there is, while the program itself is perhaps not as familiar or people aren't as confident they know what it is, we did see that more people were working with advocates. So these folks who say, I'm not sure if I've heard of it, they reported having worked with advocates. So um, whether they think of them as part of this program or not is a different question, but they were having some engagement with different members of our team. But we do think there's a need for increased outreach, networking opportunities, and learning events to just increase that awareness and broaden participation in the program. And so we've got different feedback from advocates and engaged farmers about how to improve things. And so our advocates shared that sometimes it was hard to find farmers who wanted to work with them. You know, cold calling, door-to-door visits are not going to work. Um, and while sometimes we might think, oh, these are close-knit communities, you know a lot of people, you know, some of them really did struggle to find people who were willing to have these conversations and work with them. And so targeting farmers with demonstrated interest could improve engagement, finding ways, whether it's through the Nature Conservancy or other partners, to help make those connections for the advocates so they can find those people who want to work with them. And just streamlining that access that our advocates have to farmer contacts could really enhance the success of these programs in the future. And then also addressing competition among farmers. So competition can hinder participation, and we've heard this in a lot of other projects too, that there can be some discomfort. Again, talking about your successes or your failures, because it's a competitive world, and you know, land prices are expensive, and we don't want to necessarily give our competitors an advantage. And so there might be some value in engaging farmers from outside those immediate social circles, you know, from the immediate community, the county. It might reduce some of those concerns. And again, we do think those one-on-one interactions provide a judgment-free space for discussion and get rid of that challenge a little bit. But it might be nice if advocates have the ability to work with people who are like a county over, a couple counties over, even if it's working with them kind of remotely through conversations might be helpful. And our advocates, you can see the big red bar here, is that they still felt like they were dealing with a bit of an anti-conservation status quo. So while we see in a lot of data that the majority of farmers do think good farmers do conservation, our advocates felt like a lot of doors were closed, and that some of the interest they were hoping to see from their peers just wasn't there. And we also did want to get some feedback on what makes an advocate a good advocate. Um, and you can see some of the feedback here again, both from the advocates themselves and then from some of the engaged farmers. But good advocates are farmers who can foster that collaborative, non-judgmental environment. They can share information and resources without criticism. They can dedicate time and resources to engagement. So you might have someone who loves the idea of doing this, but just in reality doesn't have the time. Um, and you've got to have the time and the willingness to commit that time. And they can connect with those middle adopters who share similar values. And you can see one of the things that our advocates talked about was the ability to speak farmer, having the right access to people, and just having the time to engage being some of the most important things. So I'll end with that. Hopefully you have a few minutes if there's any burning questions, but feel free to scan the QR code to go and look at more of the results and get a fuller picture of what all we learned. But some of the takeaways are we think there are clear advantages to these peer learning programs. We see some evidence of shifting beliefs, but really getting to these conservation outcomes at scale could take time. And we see some evidence of shifts happening, but at a pretty small scale at this point. And so the goal is to try to scale that up moving forward. So I'll stop with that.